We will now continue to part 2 of this presentation. In addition to nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, the 3 other macronutrients are magnesium, calcium, and sulfur. They can occasionally be deficient in upper Midwestern states. A soil test is the best method for detecting sufficiency levels in a soil. Sufficiency level refers to the level where the plant should have enough of the nutrients to grow properly. Micronutrients are sometimes applied as part of a fertilizer program. However, they are rarely deficient or toxic in field conditions. In some rare cases, micronutrients have been reported to be toxic in effluent water sources or manure-based fertilizers. With the exception of nitrogen, a soil test is the best method for determining the physical and chemical properties of a soil. A soil test should be completed at or before establishment for a new site to be established with turf. The most important information from a soil test report will include soil pH, percent organic matter, soil texture, and phosphorus and potassium concentrations. Soil pH affects the availability of nutrients in soil and will typically vary between 5.5 and 8.0. Soil organic matter affects nitrogen concentrations and the exchangeability of nutrient cations. Percent organic matter is strongly influenced by soil type, and typical ranges are between 3 and 15% for most Midwestern soils. Soil texture refers to the amount of sand, silt, and clay in the soil. Coarser soils are described as higher amounts of sand, whereas finer soils have higher amounts of silt or clay. Depending on the soil, the laboratory will choose to use either the Bray or Olsen procedures for determining the concentration of phosphorus in solution. Recommended sufficiency levels for turf maintenance are 25 parts per million using Bray and 15 parts per million phosphorus using Olsen. The potassium sufficiency level is typically around 100 parts per million. Each of the above is generally included in a soil testing laboratory's basic soil test. The University of Minnesota Soil Testing Laboratory charges approximately $17 for a basic soil test. Shown on this slide is a soil test report of a basic soil analysis by the University of Minnesota Soil Testing Laboratory for a Minnesota lawn. Please take a moment to review this soil test report. In addition to the actual soil test results, many soil testing laboratories provide an interpretation and recommendation for the site based on the soil test report. In this example soil test report, phosphorus is considered to be low. As a result, the laboratory recommends 1 pound phosphate per 1,000 square feet. As was mentioned previously, soil pH affects nutrient availability. This figure is not exact but helps to visualize the influence of soil pH on various nutrient availabilities. As a bar narrows, the availability of that nutrient decreases around that soil pH. As you are fertilizing, be aware of your surroundings. Most importantly, avoid applying fertilizer near surface bodies of water. Roadsides are naturally close to impervious surfaces such as roads, sidewalks, bike paths, driveways, or parking lots. Clean all fertilizer from these impervious surfaces with a broom or leaf blower. Do not apply a fertilizer application before an anticipated rainfall of 1 inch or more. Fertilizer should not be applied to frozen soil. Be sure to calibrate your fertilizer spreader for each change in source of fertilizer product and at least once a year. Now that we understand the factors that might affect a fertilizer application decision, let's work through planning a fertilizer program. As was mentioned previously, nitrogen is the most needed nutrient by the turf plant, so we will build our fertilizer program around nitrogen needs of the turf as the first step. In determining the amount of nitrogen to be applied annually, it is important to remember that soil tests will not help you determine your turf's nitrogen needs. Knowing what the nitrogen needs of the turf are will largely be based on your own experience or from speaking with colleagues in the field. Specific factors you should consider include the turf species and cultivar, how the turf will be used, and the quality of stand desired. The turfgrass species grown on roadsides vary in their nitrogen requirement. Please take a moment to review this table. The ranges listed in the table include medium to high maintenance situations. Roadsides will very likely receive lower amounts of nitrogen than a medium to high maintenance lawn. Note the difference in nitrogen requirement for fine fescue compared to Kentucky bluegrass, which results in fine fescues being better adapted to roadsides receiving very little maintenance. Many factors play a role in how much nitrogen should be applied to a turf. Probably the most influential factor on how much nitrogen to apply are the expectations for the site. Higher expectations will often require higher amounts of nitrogen. Expectations are often based on how the turf will be used. For example, a turf stand that needs to recover from damage, such as wear or divots, will have a higher nitrogen requirement. Management decisions will also impact annual nitrogen needs. Returning or not collecting clippings when mowing can preserve as much as 1/3 of the turf stand's nitrogen needs for a year. Overseeding is sometimes performed to encourage a turf stand to fill in, and would require supplemental nitrogen beyond normal maintenance level needs. Some factors may not be directly in control of the turf manager, but will still affect the annual nitrogen requirement. Shade can reduce the growth rate of grasses and their nitrogen requirement by as much as 50%. Some diseases that affect turf grasses can be remedied by raising or lowering the amount of nitrogen applied. Moisture from rainfall or irrigation may encourage turf growth or, in some cases, cause a loss of nutrients from the soil by leaching. Finally, soil type can play a significant role in the amount of nitrogen required. Turf grown on soils having a higher organic matter will require lower amounts of nitrogen, whereas soils having a low organic matter content will likely require more nitrogen. After you understand what the turf stand's annual nitrogen needs are, you can begin planning out when to apply nitrogen to meet those needs. Fertilizer should be applied when it is most beneficial to the turf, which is ultimately dictated by the growth cycle of the plants. In general, you should apply the fertilizer when the roots and shoots are actively growing. This is a time when the plants have the highest need for nutrition and will also have the highest rate and amount the plant can take up of the nutrients applied. Modern medium to high maintenance cool season turfgrass fertility programs focus on 3 times of the year. In the spring, the goal is to give the turf just enough nitrogen to encourage green up. Some nitrogen in the summer is necessary for the plants to prevent chlorosis or yellowing of the leaf blades. Fall fertilization is the most important time of year because it allows for increased storage of carbohydrates and encourages root and rhizome production. Now that you have a general idea of when the nitrogen should be applied to the turf, you should begin planning specifics of the program. These specifics should include application rates, type of fertilizer, and target date of application. Keep in mind the many factors that will affect annual nitrogen needs, as these may require fertilizer programs to be property or location specific. This is an example of an ideal fertilization schedule for a high visibility roadside and is helpful when learning about optimum fertilizer application dates throughout the year. Please take a moment to review this table. Most roadsides will receive between 0.5 and 1.0 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet at the time of establishment only. For a predominantly fine fescue urban roadside, where expectations may be higher, such as a boulevard beside government or commercial buildings, the following application dates and amount would be sufficient. Take note that early fall is the optimal time of year to apply nitrogen for fine fescue turf. Please take a moment to review this table of a fertilization schedule for Kentucky bluegrass. The ideal fertilization strategy for Kentucky bluegrass will be similar to fine fescues, but with lower amounts of nitrogen applied throughout the growing season. The final step in the planning process is to actually fertilize. Be sure to take accurate and detailed records of the time, date, location, applicator, fertilizer source, rate, amount of product used, as well as the spreader and spreader settings. This will allow you to make adjustments for the next application. Let's take a moment to review the most important concepts from this presentation. Nitrogen is the most important nutrient for plant growth. You will model your fertility program around nitrogen applications, which will be based on site conditions and expectations. Conduct soil tests to determine phosphorus, potassium, and other macronutrient needs. Similarly, consider all 17 essential elements in your turfgrass growing environment. Finally, remember that there are broader implications of fertilizer applications beyond the immediate economic costs. Thank you for viewing the Fertilization of Roadsides module. In the next module, we will discuss weed control for roadsides.